What we did is we start a storyboarding process where myself, the camera operator and guy would sit down, open the script on page 1 and we say, okay, what do we do for this first shot? And so we discussed every single shot in the movie and drew it on a storyboard frame. So by the time we got to filming, we had the entire movie mapped out in our heads anyway. For instance, with this scene, which is a sunbed scene, we had every single shot drawn out beforehand, so we knew every angle of when it was opening and when it was closing.
Mind your language in front of the boy. Jesus Christ!
Sometimes when you're shooting, scenes take on their own life. And so then we just throw the storyboards out the window and go with whatever happened. There was a particular scene when they've just bought the shotguns, and it's a scene shot in one Steadicam shot. And that was, we just made that up on the day because we had a storyboard of very complicated shots, and it just seemed very busy. And we didn't have much time, so we thought, right, let's just try and get the whole thing in one Steadicam shot. And that's when we started off on the barrels with the smoke coming from the guns. And in a scene like that, we'd just let the actors do what they want to do, and we'd watch it with Guy and say, okay, well, how should we approach this scene? So we said, we'll start off on a close-up of that and do the whole scene in one take. And that worked pretty well.
I feel safer with a chicken drumstick.
This is an example of how basic the film lighting is in this movie. Here's a scene which goes on for 5-10 minutes of them talking about scams to make money, and it's lit with one light. There's one small light on the right-hand side, and that's it. So it was just very, very basic. And what was interesting about this is where I put the lights. I mean, just a single light source can sometimes look much better than 20 or 30 lights. So sometimes being forced into a low-budget, no-money film makes you make decisions which are more interesting. Here again, we got Sting, and I just laid one fluorescent tube on the bar between the two of them, and that's what lights him. And this is the thing about lighting people's faces in an interesting direction. It just comes from down there and lights up his face. It just looks great. What it does, it gives you a really nice highlight in the eyes. It's not really where you're supposed to put a light for film lighting, but it just works.
You tell Harry to go fuck himself.
Niven contributed by speeding stuff up and slowing stuff down, like in the drunk scene, which we hadn't initially planned for.
So this drunk scene was all shot at 48 frames a second, and Guy didn't really know in his mind exactly how he wanted it to end up. So I just had to play with the footage and did lots of frame cutting, because one thing that we had established is that we were going to do lots of freeze frames and actually change the time frame within the movie a lot and exploit some of those effects that we were using on commercials and music videos. Frame cutting is also known as skip printing, where you actually print a frame, skip 4 frames, print another frame. And we call it frame cutting because you're literally, rather than doing a speed change, you're choosing a frame, cutting several out, choosing another frame. So it makes it very fast, and I did that in the drunk scene. Lock stock was all shot Super 16, except for the extremely slow shots. The suitcase bursting open as they run down the staircase. That was Photosonic's camera, which was running at, say, 300 frames a second, so it's very high speed.
If you're filming normal live action, you would film it at 25 frames per second and project it at 25 frames per second, so that 1 second's worth of event takes 1 second to watch. If you want 1 second's event to take 10 seconds to watch, like the suitcase full of money, you need to film at 10 times the normal speed. So 10 times by 25 frames per second is 250 frames per second. And so that's what they've done here. They filmed the action at 250 frames per second and then projected it back at 25 frames per second, so that 1 second's event takes 10 seconds to watch, which is why stuff takes so long. But then to get back to normal speed, you simply cut frames out, cut it back from 250 frames per second, back down to 25 frames per second, and then it will run at normal time. So that's how you mix between extreme slow-mo and normal time footage, and it's called frame cutting. Let's have him really slow down as he hits the top of the staircase, use all that frame information because we've shot at high speed. Then he comes down the stairs in normal speed, so let's go back to 25 frames per second by cutting frames out. And then when he gets near the bottom of the staircase, Jason throws the case into the air, and we want that to be really slow before it hits the ground at normal speed. And so essentially what Niven's got is he's got 50 seconds worth of footage, which is only about 3 seconds worth of event, and he can cut frames out of that at any rate he likes to say, let's make this bit last slow and run that at 250 frames per second, let's make this bit run normal and run that at 25 frames per second, and anything in between. And you can make that decision when you want. So Guy can look at the suitcase in the air and say, now's the point to drop it, not earlier, not later, right now. That's where you speed it up to normal speed and make it hit the ground, for example, and you have all that control in the editing suite.
We had really grand ideas of how that was going to look, and it was fantastic. But on the day, we got the cheapest 16mm Photosonics camera you could find because we couldn't afford anything else, and we stuck it up there. And as you can see, the quality is fairly abysmal. So we thought, okay, on the next one, we'll get a proper Photosonics camera for the girl firing a machine gun. And that was even worse.
It's time to say goodnight, nurse.
The scene coming up where Susie Ratner, the girl that's asleep on the couch, picks up the Bren gun, had caused us problems. It had been shot with a Photosonics camera running extremely fast.
Normally when you shoot at 25 frames per second for normal shooting, you would light it in a certain way. If you're going to shoot things 4 times faster, you need to put more light on the object. The film's going through the camera so quickly that it has such a small amount of time to expose. Okay? And you need, if the light on the object isn't bright enough for that exposed film to accept it, the images will end up looking dark, which was the case. This Perfect Action was too dark. As the film in the cartridge gets up to speed, there are frames earlier on down the roll which have almost sufficient exposure.
So we had to enhance them digitally, and we took them to CineSite, and they were very cleverly used frames where the camera wasn't quite up to speed to matte in the background around the action.
And so we looked at it and we saw things like areas of her dress, parts of the wall, the pictures on the wall, the light. There were frames earlier on in the roll, which was not the action we wanted, but nevertheless in the take that we wanted, there was information that was sufficient that we could take that information and then apply it to the area of the take that was wanted. But really it's just a question of taking lit elements which are light and applying them to the shot which was dark. It was very hard to work on her face, her expression was changing, and we had to use some sort of grading on that. And with her dress, when she's moving around turning with the gun, obviously we had to take patches of her dress where the exposure was better and apply those patches to her darker dress, and then because she's moving, motion track those elements onto her dress to end up with the shot looking the way it finally does, which is still fairly dark but a lot brighter than it was to begin with.
Although it doesn't look like it's had a lot of work on it, it was very painstakingly worked on at CineSite, and they did a great job.
Through this whole film, the low budgetness of it made it quite interesting, because you have to think on your feet. You've got a day to get that scene or these 3 scenes, and you know you're never going to go back and do anything again, so you either get it or you don't. This is an example of how low budget this film was. We wanted the guy to be run down in the street, so he got a stuntman and he stood in front of the car and the car ran him down. Oh, it was amazing. I was like, oh, that's it? I thought there was something more mysterious to it. And as the car came, he just jumped up on the bumper and let him hit him. He had a bruise, the biggest bruise over the whole side of his body. I'm amazed he didn't have broken ribs, but we just did it one time. He got knocked over for real, and that's the take. Okay, so this shot where he loses at cards and steps out of the ring and the camera's attached to him is an absolute steal from Mean Streets. We saw that and we loved it. We liked the disorientation, because in Mean Streets he's drunk while he's wearing this thing. So we thought, losing at cards and being in shock is kind of the same thing as being drunk. But I don't know how they did it, but we had no money. So we got a weight training belt, which he put around his waist, got a tripod, we tied it to his belt, and then from the tripod it came straight out at an angle like this. We plopped the camera on the end and pointed it at him, and they had 2 grips holding the end of the camera, and wherever he stood up the guys had to go with him. And the great thing about that is wherever he goes the camera will follow him because it's attached to him. The shot actually looks quite slick there, but when you actually watched it being shot, there are 2 grips trying to carry it and they're trying to pass it through the ropes, and it was absolute chaos.
We loved that kind of effect. I tried that on this scene where it slightly locked in, where the movement was slight, but sometimes went over itself. It gave you this feeling of being slightly nauseous.
It's not perfect, you know, the framing goes a bit weird, but it's the spirit of the shot that's good. Quite often the little imperfections and mistakes actually add up to the whole texture of the film, and you can't be too precious, because I look at it and go, oh God, I should have done this and I should have done that. But the punter looks at it and really all they care about is it a good story and is it fun.